Now, I think the place to begin is with a note on the language that I use here and why I use it, okay? So the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum is what the British state called the criminal wing that they set up in Bethlem. Okay, we would obviously use different language today. So when I say criminal lunatic, I'm using the technical term that they themselves used, all right? I will stick to using those terms. It doesn't mean that I approve of them, but actually the term criminal lunatic is with us as a legal definition all the way through until the 1930s. It sticks in Britain for a very long time. I don't think, so that's what I'm doing. I would use air quotes the whole time, but my fingers will die if I do that, okay? So please bear with me. It is not the language I would choose, but it is the language that the records themselves refer to, and that's why I'm doing it, okay? So, with that, we will get on with a history of this provision, this forensic provision in the hospital of Bethlem. And we start in the obvious place to start, which is with a squirrel. So this is one of the oldest artworks we have in the collection. It's a really charming piece describing a man's love for his sadly deceased pet squirrel. This man, James Hadfield, would sell this poem to important visitors who came past his cell. This is probably in the middle of the 1820s when he's doing this. James had a light, airy room at the top of Bethlem's criminal unit, which it called the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum. And the people who came in would have been important people in society, usually people who knew the governors. And he used the money that he sold from writing these poems about his deceased pet squirrels who would come and visit him through the windows to buy snuff, which was a dreadful vice, according to his patient notes. All very nice. Except we probably know James Hadfield better as the man who took a pot shot at George III in the theatre in 1800. And Hadfield presented a new set of challenges to the British legal system. So Hadfield stood up in 1800, James Hadfield stood up in the theatre at Drury Lane and shot at George III's royal box. You can see the action here, him standing and him shooting. On inspection of Hadfield, it turned out he was a war hero. He had served in the Duke of York's personal guard in the Napoleonic Wars, and he had taken dreadful blows to the head. He was visibly hurt in action. So both a war hero, decorated war hero, and a man who'd seen service, and yet also a man who'd been driven to shoot at the king. And it turned out that the reasons he shot at the king is that he believed that he had to die, but that he could not complete suicide. So he decided to shoot at the king, and then he would be executed. Now this presented real problems for the British state. Hadfield had clearly attempted to kill George III, and yet he was also very clearly not in the right frame of mind. And his brilliant solicitor, Thomas Erskine, argued that therefore he could not be held to a criminal standard of responsibility for his actions, because he was under the influence of insanity at the time that the act was committed. And actually this is the beginnings, well, together with money issues. Insanity is a legal definition rather than a medical one. Okay. And what this does, and the subsequent panic of legislation around the not guilty verdict that was returned for Hadfield, it led to a definition of a criminal lunatic. This was essentially consisted of people who had undoubtedly committed the crime that they were on trial for, but could not be held responsible for that crime because of their mental health issues. Okay? Now, this kind of sounds like these so-called criminal lunatics dropped out of space, out of nowhere. But actually that's not true at all. Bethlem had always held people who had been a nuisance, essentially. Ooh. In particular, the most famous case was Margaret Nicholson, another alleged would-be assassin of George III, who in 1783 I think. Sorry, I've lost my dates here. 1786, sorry. You can see this scene here, appeared to have tried to assassinate George III, in this case with an incredibly blunt and rusty bread knife. Now, Margaret always maintained her innocence in these matters. And as he was carried away, George III shouted out, "Do not harm this woman. She is not well. Help her." And these words, again, caused something of a quandary. And the compromise was that Margaret would be placed in Bethlem. Bethlem had taken other people who had been a nuisance to the royal family, usually through something called the Border Green Cloth, which was sort of the instrument of Parliament designed to look after the royal family. So there was this sort of quasi-system of taking on people who'd been a nuisance that the state didn't really know what to do with. But with Hadfield, it really focused the mind of people. It focused the idea that perhaps there was this different class of people who were likely to commit violence for their mental health issues, okay, who could not be held to a criminal standard, but something must be done for them. Now, there is a very long, wrangly process that the British state then undertakes to try and help people, okay, to try and lay down the rules. And between 1808 and 1816, they basically come up with an idea that what they will do is they will create a part of Bethlem Hospital that is not necessarily run just as Bethlem Hospital, but is run as what they refer to as the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Bethlem is in the process of moving, even in 1806. So the second site was up here, and Bethlem is planning to move down here into Moorfields. This is what the first hospital looks like. And what the state comes up with in the 1808, and you will like this, the Act for the Better Care and Maintenance of Lunatics being Paupers or Criminals, that's the full title of the Act, they were into snappy titles back then, is that they will pay for the care of these people out of the central government, but they will outsource the responsibility for this care to Bethlem Hospital. Okay? What they're particularly looking for are those who could not be safely left to the county asylum system, which back in 1808 is more of a sort of dream than an actual reality at this point. After 6 years of negotiation, the new hospital in St George's Field is built, and what comes with it is accommodation for 45 male criminal lunatics and 15 female criminal lunatics spread across 2 wards. Now, this is what the hospital looks like when it was first built, and the criminal lunatic wards are out the back of either side. I don't actually have views of how these wards looked when they were created. However, I do have views after 1838, and this is when the hospital acquires its fancy new dome and starts becoming recognised as what it is today, the site of the Imperial War Museum. Probably the best view is from behind. We have this panoramic view, and you can see this building out here is the male criminal ward, and this building sticking out here is the female criminal ward. And you can see on the plan of the revised hospital from 1838 what these 2 buildings look like. This is one here, and this is one here. Now, these views are after the hospital doubles the capacity of the criminal wards. Okay, so at this point in time, the male side can house around about 90 people, and the female side can, in theory, house 30 people. Okay, now, it's kind of hard to tell, but that is not a particularly big unit for 90 people. All right. So, although from Hadfield's poem addressed to his squirrel, which kind of implies a light, airy, bucolic environment to which the animals come to visit us, actually these photos and these plans reveal a slightly different story. Okay, so one thing I don't want to give is a sense that these are particularly pleasant accommodations, even in these early days. And actually, what the government find is that when they start introducing their definition of criminal lunatic, this is taken up with great gusto by the courts. You know, as soon as you define something, this creates not exactly a demand, but a knowledge that this is a possibility, which kind of suggests, I think, that people with mental health problems are probably always present in the criminal justice system, but it's only when you get law, legislation, and a recognition of them that you start seeing this being acknowledged in court and at trial. Okay. From 1843, there's a further codification in the law, and that's with the case of this man, Daniel Macnaghten. Okay. The reason it's an M is that's the way modern scholars have decided his name should be spelled. Okay, there's about 5 different ways of doing it. Macnaghten was a Glasgow-based carpenter who started to believe that he was being personally persecuted by the Prime Minister. And it's a really awful case which ends with him coming down to London and stabbing the Prime Minister's private secretary, thinking it's him. Macnaghten was again defended brilliantly, and what came out of his trial was certain standards for recognising not guilty by reason of insanity, certain criteria that had to be met. Now, eminent legal historians believe that actually this was perhaps not very helpful across the 1800s, because juries still tended to allow the plea of defence by insanity with anything that sounded vaguely in the region of mental health issues. So how helpful these standards actually were is open for debate. But again, it opens the door to a greater understanding of what's trying to happen with people. And the Macnaghten laws go on to form the basis for a criminal understanding of criminal lunacy. Again, this term is in place up until the 1930s, across the English-speaking world. So Macnaghten's case is actually very influential, if not actually very helpful to sort of understanding. It's also the beginning of doctors being called as expert witnesses. So this is probably the case of the beginnings of criminal psychology, trying to understand what compels somebody to actually undertake crimes. Obviously it starts with mental health issues, because that's the kind of hot button topic, but this opens the door to a greater understanding of mental health in the criminal justice system. Now, we actually start getting a greater understanding of what the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum part of Bethlem looks like with the appointment of William Charles Hood as superintendent in 1852. This is Hood here looking very serious. Now, Hood was a new brew. He came in with ideas around changing Victorian psychiatry, moving away from the idea of psychiatry being containing an issue to treating an issue. And Hood's great idea was, Hood was employed essentially to instill the ideas of moral therapy, which I almost said was Hood's idea. They were not. They were the ideas that came out of John Connolly in Hanwell. But the idea was to provide routines, occupations, pleasant environments for patients. Now, some of you may realise this makes sense when you have absolute control over your hospital and your hospital population. But of course, Hood does not have this. The State Criminal Lunatic Asylum is still part of the British state. So Hood is in charge of day-to-day treatment, but to make large changes, he must require the sign-off of the British state, which at this point has handed over kind of the duties of providing pleasant accommodation for its criminals to the inspectorate, who are the charmingly named Commissioners of Lunacy at this point. So Hood has to work Hood has full power over his hospital, except with the 2 criminal wings, where he must negotiate with the commissioners on how he wants to do things. A very long, laborious process that actually involves lots of meetings. One thing Hood does have the power to do, though, is he has the power to bring in his own staff to run the place. And the man he brings in to run the day-to-day operations of the whole hospital, but in particular the criminal wing, is a man called George Henry Hayden. This chap here, I will say this photo is taken far longer after his appointment in 1853. Hayden is very well regarded by pretty much everybody he comes into contact with. And his aim is to restore the morale of the criminal department, which at this point is not in particularly good state. To try and illustrate what Hood and Hayden wanted, I'll show you a picture of what Bethlem's main patient wings looked like in the 1850s. Now, this is a puff piece, okay? This is what Hood himself wanted in the papers. But I think what it does is it speaks to what Hood envisaged for his hospital, okay? So you see very high ceilings, you see big windows, you see a light, airy environment, modern oil lamps at the top. You see men dressed well in their day-to-day clothing. clothing's huge for the Victorians, really important. You see lots of occupations going on. You see people playing music, you see people playing games, you see cabinets of curiosity in the side here. Yeah? You see surprising things. You can see 2 dogs, who are probably Hood's own greyhounds that we know he took out on rounds with him. You can see a bird cage at the back and a smaller bird cage at the front. You can also see they're looking at a cat as well. I always like that. The idea is this place is so orderly, the dogs don't chase the cats. Yeah. Which, let's face it, is almost certainly nonsense. But the cats are real. The cats started off as kitchen mouses and came up to the hospital wards. The idea that Hood was going for is a pleasant, homely environment, but away from the stresses of home. However, this is much more difficult when you have patients who are perhaps violent. Remember, these are patients that the county asylum system cannot hold, where you don't have the freedom to implement physical changes to your buildings, which Hood does not, and where you perhaps don't have the same calibre of staff, which Hood really didn't either. Okay, so this is Hood's vision, and actually, Hood comes into the hospital with very high hopes for the State Criminal Lunatic Department. He feels he can change this. He feels he can turn it around. Within 2 years, Hood has published a book talking about how dreadful the situation is for criminal lunatics and how he doesn't want any part of treating them. So there is a very big change that happens very quickly. And I think it's because Hood wants very large change and he's not getting it. So at this point, we start getting descriptions of the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum, and it's not particularly pleasant. So Hood does try to make changes. He tries to implement, he moves 40 patients to another part of the hospital where they can have a situation a bit more like this. They're able to have certain amenities like a library and larger outside space. He also tries to move some of the female patients out from the criminal wing and into the more settled patient units as well, because they are thought to be non-violent. Having said all of that, by 1857, an outside review into the hospital notes when they come into the criminal asylum, despite having had very high, very nice words to say about the main patient wings, going into the criminal wings, the quarterly review notes, "These dens, for we can call them by no softer name, are the only remaining representatives of old Bethlem. They consist of dismal arched corridors, feebly lit at either end by a single window and double irons, and divided in the middle by gratings, more like those which enclose the fiercer carnivora at the zoological gardens than we have seen elsewhere employed for the detention of afflicted humanity." So Hood, despite trying to make changes, is still left with a place that's more like a dismal, old-school place of containment, more like a prison. Okay. So there are some signs of the things Hood is able to do with some of his patients. In particular, one of the more difficult patients that he inherits in the criminal wing is Richard Dadd. Now, you might have heard Richard Dadd as a painter, which he was. You see him at his easel here in 1857. But Dadd came into the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum as somebody who had murdered his father in 1843. He came into Bethlem in 1844 following his conviction not guilty by reasons of insanity. And Dadd remained a very violent patient even into the 1850s. He was somebody that the staff felt could not be reasoned with, could not be easily contained or controlled. He was happy when painting, so the Hood ensured that he had a reasonable amount of painting material, though he did paint before as well, because it was the one thing that could keep him calm. To occupy Richard, Hood set him a series of tasks, and he set him the task of painting the Passions. Now, these are all out on display on this side of the temporary exhibition space, so I do urge you to have a look. The passions to the Victorians were the things that made man man. Okay? So we see a selection of what we hold here. They weren't, simply things that everybody experienced. They were the driving emotions that could push somebody over the edge of their sanity. And what Hood wanted Dad to do was consider the reason that he had ended up in the situation he had ended up, to force some sort of reflection. Now, perhaps to us today, very familiar with art therapy, this will feel, like something you would expect. In a Victorian era, before talking therapies, I actually think this confrontation is quite something. It's something quite different. It is designed to keep Richard occupied. It's designed to give him a challenge. We know he responded to challenges, particularly technical challenges, with his painting. But it's also designed to give him a sort of a subject reference as well, perhaps to aid his own recovery. Again, it's relatively far-sighted. Hood was a man of his word as well. He tried to give Dad the material, the time, the space, the canvases, in order to express himself as well. It's not just enough to set him this task, you must enable him as well. So I think we get some idea of what Hood's attempting to do here. I think you can say this wasn't particularly successful. Particularly, I'll just draw your attention to one of the passions. This is murder. You'll see here, this is taken from Shakespeare's, I think it's Henry VI. And it casts Dad, you can see it's depicting murder. Now, if you look at Dad's face, and if you look at the murderer's face, I think you can see a striking resemblance. Now, Dad actually stabbed his father to death as well. And you can see there is a sword with blood on it. I don't exactly think you can see a level of contrition here, or a level of understanding. Dad has essentially painted himself as a hero in his own version of this. So I think one can always question how much influence has Hood had on Dad in this photo. And actually, although there is a great temptation, and I think it is fair to present Hood as a reforming presence, doing his best in a difficult situation with very difficult patients, that he must manage at the same time as running a very large civilian hospital, which the civilian side alone has 250 people at this time. How much impact he actually had on his patients, I think, is open to question. There's another revealing couple of paintings by Dad. The first is of the doctor who came before Hood, Alexander Morrison, painted in it. Now, we dated at 1852, that's when Morrison leaves Bethlem. And so this is the date we vaguely have for this painting. Whether it is or not, it's possibly a bit earlier. And this is Dad's portrait of a young man, very often identified as Hood. Now, when I first saw these paintings, particularly this sort of slightly seasicky painting of Morrison, incidentally, this is Morrison's house. Dad had never seen Morrison's house. So quite what the message is here, I know where you live. Not entirely sure. But there is a sort of slightly seasicky fairy tale-ness to this that I sort of felt quite negatively about, whereas this one seems quite calm and contemplative, like quite so I always viewed one perhaps more favourably than the other. One seemed to give a more favourable impact than the other. But if you look at how he's depicted the two doctors, so clearly one is old, one is young. How much actual difference has Dad shown here? They're very formal, they're wearing evening clothes, they have their hands in front of them. I just wonder if maybe this reflects the fact that Dad is not seeing a lot of change. Here comes the new boss, same as the old boss. Is that really what he's saying to us here? We have no way of knowing. Dad was not one to explain himself, even to people that he regarded favourably. And he seemed to have communicated much more with Hood and Hayden than he had with other people. But even then, he's not one to necessarily always explain the motives behind his paintings. But I do wonder if this actually reflects the fact that the patients in the hospital possibly didn't actually see an awful lot of progress under Hood. Which again, I'm not totally sure is his fault. This all comes, Bethlem's brief sojourn as the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum comes to an end in 1863. Hood's politicking is actually successful, maybe not in its own right, but he captures a current, a way of thinking about what it is to be about what it is to have committed a criminal act because of your mental health issues. And Hood's arguments against them are actually fairly good. In the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum in Bethlem, you had men who had committed violent crimes and were in hospital for that, rubbing up against men who had developed mental health issues while in prison. You had men who were effectively, particularly men, who had recovered from the mental health issues that caused them to commit their crimes, next to people who were in the grip of their mental health issues. There was no delineation. And actually, Hood's arguments reach a receptive audience, and even from the mid-1850s, movement is in place to set up a specialist institute. And what comes along in 1863 is Broadmoor Hospital, which receives Bethlem's female patients in 1863 and receives the men in 1864, including Richard Dad. Broadmoor is right out in the country, whereas Bethlem is right in the middle of town. Broadmoor has a specialist series of blocks that actually treats patients by severity of their mental health issues, where they are now, how likely they are to be violent. And so is able to segregate patients more than Bethlem can as well. And this removes what Hood is increasingly seeing as a problem he cannot fix from the hospital. Okay. What I will do, though, just before we go on and we have a look at the archives, is I will leave you with one of the success stories of the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum, because there was at least one. And it's a man called Edward Oxford. This is his photograph. Now, Edward is most famous, came into the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum because he had taken 2 shots at Queen Victoria as she was going around Hyde Park in her buggy. Now, what nobody could ever prove was that the guns that he'd used to shoot at Queen Victoria were loaded. They never found any bullets. He'd undoubtedly stepped out in front of the carriage and drawn 2 pistols and fired them. But whether he intended her harm or not, nobody could ever discern. And when they went to check his apartments, they discovered that Edward Oxford was a conspiracy of one. He had formed his own secret society. Only member E. Oxford. He was writing notes in code. He was writing conspiracy theories before conspiracy theories. In some ways, we hear a lot of stories of sort of lone gunmen radicalising themselves on the internet. Edward managed it even in the pre-internet era. But the shock of going to trial and being adjudged not guilty for reasons of insanity seemed to be the shock that Edward needed. He came to Bethlem, where you will see that we've actually have a document where he is described in the quarterly returns as sane, even by the doctors. So it seemed to be the shock that he needed almost to pull himself out of whatever was going on with him. He was a teenager when he took the shots at Queen Victoria, whether there was something, whether it was immaturity, perhaps more than a mental health issue, we'll never know. So at Bethlem, he learned languages, he learned how to paint. Not like Richard Dad, not an artist, but as a decorator, which is how you see him, how he presents himself in this photo. And he moved to Broadmoor, but it very quickly became clear that he did not belong there. He was fundamentally okay. And what happened was, now, the technical language behind being a criminal lunatic was that you were to be detained at your Majesty's pleasure, even though you were not guilty. So the Broadmoor authorities started negotiating with Queen Victoria, who, let's face it, was not overly keen on allowing somebody who'd taken a shot at her to wander off into the sunset. So what they negotiated was that Edward would emigrate, and he'd be able to start a new life in Australia. And he did. And he did very successfully under the name of John Freeman. And you'll be able to see the book he published over when we go and have a look at the archives. Now, when you go into the main museum, you go to the pod in the far left-hand corner of the permanent displays. The first thing you'll hear, you'll trigger a sound. And the first recording you'll hear is our director reading a letter. That letter is from Edward Oxford, to George Henry Hayden, describing his new life in Australia. And I'll just finish by reading a bit of it. For a man who has once been in the grip of the law to remain where he is known stands but a poor chance among those who have not. It makes no matter what his offence, or whether he has paid the full pound of flesh 10 times over. The taint clings to him like a leprosy. All that at a distance, and where he is unknown, is prevented. He can then find his own level by putting on the bold front necessary. And Oxford puts on the bold front and goes on and lives a life outside of the structures of the State Criminal Lunatic Asylum. So, I'll leave it there.